Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Patrick Flynn with Tailwind Placement Exams. And again, I want to thank you for spending part of your day with us and attending our webinar series titled 5 Things You Need to Know About Placement Testing. Today's subject is Cutscores. And as we have throughout the entire series, you will be directed by Dr. Jim Wallach and Dr. Sonia Sedeby, both of the University of Wisconsin Center for Placement Testing. And again, I'm Patrick Flynn, Senior Consultant with Castle Worldwide and Tailwind Placement Exams. This will take about 30 minutes or so, and we will have time for questions. If you have a question, please do type it into the question box in the navigation bar to the side of your screen. And once the presentation is over and we get to the Q&A part, I will read those questions to Jim and Sonia, and they will answer them for you. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Jim and Sonia. Jim and Sonia, take it away.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar on Cutscores. So the first thing that we'd like you to know, our first point with regards to Cutscores, that Cutscores really reflect a combination of the curriculum on the campus, the student body, and sometimes the enrollment capacities. So in order to appropriately set Cutscores, it's important to know the content that is being taught in each of the courses in the introductory sequence, as well as the necessary preparedness level of the students. A student is placed appropriately when they're put into a class in which they have the most potential to learn new material. And in order to do so, we need to assess whether or not they possess the prerequisite skills necessary for that particular course. Because student bodies and curricula differ across campuses, and it begs to reason that Cutscores should also differ across campuses. So for example, here in the University of Wisconsin system, we have 13 four-year campuses. Each campus has a slightly different student population, and each campus has its own mathematics curriculum. So therefore, each campus utilizes a unique set of Cutscores on the math placement test in order to determine placement into the introductory sequence in mathematics. By having the campuses have their own set of Cutscores, it helps us to ensure that we're making correct placement decisions on each of the 13 campuses. But in addition, the UW system has 13 two-year campuses. The two-year campuses have very similar student populations, and they also have a standardized curricula. And so in this situation, all 13 of the two-year campuses use the same set of Cutscores because they're placing into the same courses in which the same content is taught. We've included the addition of enrollment capacities here because we recognize that the reality is that there could be limits to the numbers of sections you may be able to offer of a particular course or courses. So while course enrollment capacities should not be the only driving force behind setting your Cutscores, sometimes this information needs to be taken into account when making minor adjustments to existing Cutscores. Factoring in the amount of space or the number of seats that you have at a certain course or at certain placement levels may be something that needs to be taken into consideration when you're setting your Cutscores. And one of the questions that we get is, well, what do we do when we're trying to set Cutscores from scratch? And so one possible approach would be to identify another campus, or even better, more than one campus that has a similar student population and a very similar curriculum to your own. The Cutscores that are in use for those similar campuses can be used as an initial starting point for determining your own Cutscores. However, you really shouldn't be blindly adopting another campus's Cutscores, because if you take Cutscores from a campus that is dissimilar to yours in terms of students and or the curricula, then their Cutscores will not be appropriate for your use. And if the Cutscores you're using are not appropriate, then it's going to appear as though your placement test is not working very well, when in fact the misplacement is due to an incorrect Cutscore decision-making process.
All right, the second point that we'd like to make is that it's important to study the effectiveness of Cutscores and adjust as needed. So Sonia just mentioned one very reasonable way to sort of start from scratch, looking at another campus, a comparable campus. Well, even if you can find another campus that's like that, that looks quite a bit like yours, you know, in terms of its student body, in terms of its curriculum, using Cutscores from another campus is really intended just to give you some place to start. It's, you know, in fact, not only is it perfectly reasonable, but it's sort of expected that you're actually going to have to modify the scores somewhat after you start using them. So, you know, during those first couple of years, when you're just starting out with this new tool, you'll want to be collecting some data to help you decide whether or not the Cutscores might need to be adjusted somewhat. If so, there are a lot of ways, you know, or there are a lot of ways that you could actually go about collecting that sort of data. You know, I think we'll get into some of those methods momentarily. We'll talk about a couple of ways that we really like, but those are going to be more appropriate once you have a few years of data under your belt. Until you get to that point, there needs to be something that you can do as well. So I think the best way for you to do this is talk to your students, talk to your faculty. You know, we generally recommend talking to them after about 4 or 5 weeks and get them to comment on the level of preparedness of their students. So you'll want to know, you know, do there seem to be a lot of students who are underprepared and maybe should have started a level down, a level lower? Are there students who seem overprepared and, you know, who you suspect might be able to actually succeed in the next higher course? You can do the same thing for students. You could actually administer a short survey if you wanted to your students and ask them whether or not they believe that course is at an appropriate level, or is it maybe too low for them or too high for them. Then once you have this, those data, you can actually take a look at whether or not you might be able to improve the proportion of students who are correctly placed if you were to move those Cutscores up or down just a little. And you know, we're going to start talking next about some of the methods that we like to use for setting Cutscores. But even after you set the Cutscores, whether it's, you know, this sort of initial setting of the Cutscores based on scores from a comparable campus, or if you've actually gone through a process of actually doing a study and you know, setting Cutscores where you think they're optimal, looking at Cutscores and collecting some sort of data on an ongoing basis just to make sure that those Cutscores are working for you is something that we, you know, recommend pretty much across the board.
We have found that one of the most effective ways in setting and adjusting Cutscores is to optimize differences between students who are correctly enrolled and over-enrolled. So we know that students are not always going to follow the advice of the placement test, and they may take a course that is either higher or lower than the one recommended by the placement instrument. If a student has taken a class that is higher than the recommendation of the placement test, then they've over-enrolled in a course. They've enrolled in a course that is higher than the one that was recommended, which can be seen here in the table in purple. But if, on the other hand, a student opts to take a course that is lower than where they placed, then they've under-enrolled, and the students who actually follow the advice of the placement test have been deemed to have correctly enrolled. They've enrolled in the course which was recommended for them. And what we've found is that comparing these groups of students and setting Cutscores in such a way that maximizes differences between these two groups is quite effective. And it also happens to be a very effective way to validate your Cutscores and to validate a placement instrument. When we're doing this, we always recommend to use an assessment that is given early in the semester for determining the group differences rather than using final grade. This is because an assessment that's given early on in the semester is actually a more appropriate indicator of whether or not a student has been placed appropriately, or are they ready to learn that new material. We all know that final grades contain many elements. There's a lot wrapped up in final grade. Perhaps the student's getting points for attendance or participation points, and quite frankly, how motivated the student was throughout the course of the semester is wrapped up in their final grade. And these elements really can confound whether or not our decision, or can confound our decision on whether or not a student was appropriately placed. And we talk a little bit more about this in a previous webinar that we gave on validation, which is archived on the website. So the score on the early assessment really helps to remove some of these confounding factors. So every student takes the assessment early on, and then scores on that assessment are given or used as a reflection of whether or not a student was appropriately placed. So by looking at group scores on that assessment, and in particular comparing the students who were over-enrolled, those who took a course higher than what would have been recommended from your cut score or your placement test, to those students who correctly enrolled, in terms of their performance on the assessment and on the placement test, we can determine appropriate cut scores. So essentially what we do is we look at different scores on the placement test, and using one cut score, we compare the students on the early assessment, what their grade was on the early assessment for those students who would be correctly placed if that cut score were utilized, to those who would be over-enrolled if that cut score were utilized. And then we slide that cut score a little bit. And we do this again. We slide the cut score and say, well, now who are the students who would be over-enrolled in the class, and how did they do on that first assessment? And who are the students who are correctly enrolled based on this new cut score, and how did they do? And we do this again. We slide the cut score around, and we look at it for many potential cut scores until we find the one which results in the largest difference between these two groups of students. And the cut score that results in the largest difference is going to be your optimal cut score between those two classes.
The fourth point is that cut scores should be set so that students placing into courses are equally prepared as students transitioning from the prerequisite course. Excuse me. One of the concerns that we have with like looking at final grade as an indicator of placement accuracy is that sort of implicit in that sort of an approach is this assumption that with correct placement everyone or nearly everyone can be successful. But we know that grades tend to with the way that grades tend to be issued, that's really not possible. So when like the average GPA in a class doesn't go up or goes up only a little, there are going to be some people who begin to question whether or not the test is working. So we need to remember that in these courses that we place into in math, in English, and foreign language, there are really two reasons why students are enrolled in a particular course, right? Either they're there because they placed into it, or they're there because they're working their way through the sequence and have most recently completed the prerequisite. So one way that we can think about setting cut scores is to set them so that the probability of success is equal for these two groups, right? We actually don't have the luxury of changing the placements of students who work their way through the sequence, right? They've taken the prerequisite course, so by definition, those students are correctly placed. So therefore, if we find that students who go through the sequence tend to perform better in the class than the students who place there, that tells us that we're overplacing. And if we find, on the other hand, that students, going through the sequence perform less well than students who place there, then that means that, we might be underplacing. So setting cut scores to ensure that newly placed students do similarly and certainly no worse than our baseline group of continuing students is actually a pretty simple and intuitive way to find cut scores.
Our final point is that the validity of a test really can't be separated from your cut scores. Poorly set cut scores are going to render a good test invalid. So using cut scores that are inappropriate is going to lead to incorrect decision making. And in other words, you're going to be misplacing students. In this instance, even a test with the strongest reliability and validity evidence will be rendered invalid. However, this does not mean that the tool you are using or the placement instrument is ineffective or broken. It simply means that it is not being used in the optimal way. We know that the validity of a placement test is going to be maximized when you have your cut scores set appropriately, where we can really start to see the individual differences. And so one of the things that you can do as somebody on your campus, either in a testing office or in a department, is to keep your eyes and ears open and hear what people are saying about the placement instrument. This is what I do when our item writers come in. If I ever hear an item writer say, you know, I feel like the placement test isn't working as well for us anymore, the first thing I ask them is, when was the last time that we looked at your cut scores? Because largely what that means, it does not mean that the placement instrument itself is not as reliable or valid. It means that the cut scores probably need to be modified somewhat in order to optimize the validity and the decisions that we're making on those individual campuses. So please keep your ears out and listen for people who are saying that maybe the placement instrument isn't working as well anymore, or that they feel like more and more students are coming and they're not prepared for a class. That's your biggest indicator that maybe you need to revisit your cut scores.
So those are the 5 things that we think you need to know about placement test cut scores. And at this time, I think we'd like to turn things over and answer any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you, Jim and Sonia. I actually do have a question here for you that I just received. In the circumstance where a program is developing a placement test from the beginning, meaning no placement test previously existed, and where there may not be an example of at other institutions, what data needs to be developed over time to inform the setting of initial cut scores?
Yes, so that's a really good question. And so that environment actually, I mean, I think what I would suggest, and we didn't mention this just because we had such a short period of time and, you know, we could only talk about 5 things, but, you know, that I think in a perfect world, you know, the best way to set cut scores, I mean, Sonia mentioned if you want to start things out, you know, use cut scores from another institution. But usually we do that because, you know, we're paying for this new placement instrument, and so we want to immediately start using it. But if you're in a situation where you're developing your own, I mean, the best thing that you can do actually is administer it and not use it for a year. Because you actually don't have any validity data yet. You don't have reason to believe that, I mean, you've got reason to believe, but you don't actually have really good evidence that this is working. So we don't have that sort of ethical responsibility to our students to use it because, for all we know, you know, it's not a very good test and might be misplacing students. So what I would recommend is that we actually administer it and just continue with whatever process you've been using, whether that's self-placement or some sort of a guided placement, or maybe it's placement even using a different measure. But that way, you can, over the course of the year, you know, you can collect data. The method that Sonia was talking about, where you're looking at differences between correctly and you know, an over-enrolled students, if you're not using a placement instrument, you're likely to get a good number of students who are not correctly enrolled. And although that's not an ideal environment for teaching purposes, it's a great environment for research purposes. So I guess what I would recommend is not using it initially, because you have to do so would be arbitrary. You have absolutely no idea, even if you think ultimately this is going to work and will give me a decent sense of, you know, a better sense of where students belong. We have no idea what those cut scores should be. So using it as an opportunity to collect some data, and then you can do the sort of study that Sonia was talking about after a year, and then continue to monitor, I think that's really your best way to go.
Just received another question. What would you request your data department to pull in order to get this validity test data?
I'm sorry, Patrick, in order to be able to get what?
What would you request your data department to have pulled in order to get validity test data? I believe I'm reading that correctly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and this goes back, and Sonia can jump in here too. But thinking back to what we talked about when we gave our validity webinar. I mean, if you're doing this after the fact, all you really have is grade and course, right? I don't necessarily know that grade and course is the best measure. It's probably the most reliable measure, but I still don't think it's necessarily the best measure of readiness. I would rather work with a campus, work with my math department, English department, foreign language departments to collect a first midterm score, to maybe administer a survey on satisfaction. If you're a small school and you're talking about like foreign language classes where the faculty may even know all of the students, asking them after 4 or 5 weeks, do you think this was the right class for each of these students, right? Give the professor a roster and say, can you please go through and indicate if you think this student is in the right class, or if this student, in retrospect, should this student have maybe been in a higher class or a lower class? Those aren't data that your campus is going to have. So if you're looking for data from your campus, I think it pretty much has to be, grade and course. If you want to pull in multiple measures or something, and you can maybe look at an ACT, SAT sort of a score, but those are old. I'm not a huge fan of looking at those, frankly, because those scores are old. They're over a year old by the time that students step onto campus, and in many cases they might be quite a bit older than that. So that is something normally that I wouldn't want to look at because it doesn't reflect what they did their senior year. I might work with my data department to help me identify who are the true freshmen in each of these classes, because that's usually, certainly for our test, that tends to be the validation sample. It's just a much stabler population. It's not to suggest that the tests are inappropriate for other groups, but you like, for purposes of equating and holding a score together and all that, for your population to remain as similar year after year. And so we tend to look at true freshmen, which, at least within our system, is defined as students with fewer than 24 transfer credits, I think. But all your data people will know how that's defined for every campus. I don't know, Sonia, what else might I be missing here?
No, I think when we do it, you've hit the main points. When we do it here, like Jim said, we restrict the sample to students with fewer than 24 transfer credits. We look at, obviously, the scores that they received on the placement test. If we have a grade on the first midterm, which with some of our campuses we will have that, it's actually recorded in CAP. We prefer to use that, or instructor ratings of whether or not a student was prepared or not prepared for the class. But if we can't get either the first midterm or an instructor rating, then we will take a final grade in the course. When we're validating, foreign language in particular, a lot of times we may want to also look at the number of years the student had the language in high school, and factor that in as well. Another thing that you need to think about is, how do you treat students who have either dropped the course or have withdrawn from the course? And a lot of times when looking at Cutscores, I'll kind of treat that group a little bit separately. I'll look and set the Cutscores using students who have actually fully completed the course, because on some of our campuses, they may receive grades really depending on, they could have taken the entire course, and if they withdrew right at the end, then they get the W on their transcript. versus even if they withdrew within the first few weeks, they may get the W on their transcript. But it's important to still look at the students who dropped or withdrew from the course and see where are their placement test scores. Overall, is that group on average, are they scoring lower on the placement test, and perhaps this is indicative that they had actually over-enrolled in a course, and that's the reason why they withdrew from the course. They realized that they weren't prepared for the course. So that group can also give you some additional information.
Very good. Next question. We got this one a couple of times. Is there a recommendation or best practices for how frequently cut scores should be reevaluated?
Whether cut scores should be reevaluated, or did you say test scores?
Cut scores.
Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, nothing really that that I can think of is jumping out at me. I mean, I think you should be revisiting cut scores, on an annual basis to a certain extent, right?
Yeah, so I mean, you should really be continually monitoring your cut scores, but maybe doing a large cut score study only every few years. I don't think a large cut score study needs to be done every year, but you should be doing the continual monitoring. Some other times to possibly revisit or to do a cut score study would be if there's been a curriculum change on your campus, including if there's been an addition of a new course to the introductory sequence or a removal of some course. Also, if there's been large curriculum changes at the high school level, we would hope that if there's large curricular changes at the high school level, that is probably going to eventually result in differences in who your incoming freshmen are. So if there's large curriculum changes at the high school level, a couple years after those changes have been implemented, you probably want to look at your cut scores and see if they're still appropriate. Other instances, like I said on the last slide, if you start hearing instructors saying that there's been an increase in the number of students who aren't ready for their course, or even in the other direction, an increase in the number of students that they feel are over-prepared and really should have been placed at a higher level, or if you hear them saying that the test just isn't working as well for them, or if you have instructors, you've seen increase in instructors asking for some of their students to take a retest because they think that maybe they weren't placed appropriately. If you have a reliable test and they take a retest, likely they're going to place into that same level, but that could be indicative that those cut scores need to be changed as well.
Very good. Next question we have, what are the implications to our campus of changing cut scores?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times we think, oh, well, we need to change cut scores because we feel they're not working very appropriately. But anytime we change cut scores, there are some other areas in your institution that are going to be impacted. And the one thing that we can be sure of when we change cut scores is that there's going to be change in the number of students who place into each course that is affected by that change. So sometimes the change is small. Maybe we see a small increase in the percentage of students at one level and therefore a small decrease in students who place in the corresponding level. But in some instances, the change could be pretty large, and it's important that this is conveyed or communicated to the department. So let's say we're talking about a math test. The math department needs to know that they can expect an increase in percentage of students for certain courses so that they can make sure that they're offering the correct number of sections of a particular course if need be, and then also decrease the number of sections for other courses. New cut scores definitely need to be communicated to the folks in the testing office. They are the ones who are administering the tests and in some instances are also issuing the placement decisions. And so they need to be aware of the new cut scores, as well as folks in advising. If there's an advising group that is helping to translate placement test scores for students and determine the appropriate placement levels. And then also probably individuals in the registrar's office need to have this information communicated to them because it can result in fairly large administrative changes on your campus in terms of course offerings. Is there anything else?
Did you mention IT?
I did not mention IT.
Right. So yeah, IT folks obviously would need to be brought into this as well. If you're changing the algorithm, a lot of campuses populate those into the student information system and all that, and want to make sure that it's correct in the student's official record, and that the way that the scores are reconciled to the placements and the other implications, there could be gen ed implications for this, that all of those are handled properly. So that's often the technology folks.
Very good. One more here. If we are struggling with placement on our campus, how do you know if it's a problem with the test or with the cut scores?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I guess it's pretty hard actually to separate those two ultimately, and in fact, I'm not really even sure if it's necessary to separate them. I think Sonia mentioned this earlier, but the way we think about it, it's really all about the cut scores. If you can find cut scores that work well for your campus, then the test is going to be a good measure for you. If you can't find appropriate cut scores, then it's not going to be a valid tool for your particular purpose. So generally speaking, if you're talking about a test that has worked well for you for some years, or it works well for another campus that you think looks a good deal like yours, generally speaking, you're going to be able to find cut scores that are going to produce good and meaningful results at your campus as well. And that's why Sonia said if you're hearing people talk about a test isn't really working as well, it's probably a case of getting those cut scores adjusted. It's not out of the question that there would be a test that just stops working as well at a particular campus, or that maybe is a valid, useful tool someplace, but that another campus, because of their nature of their curriculum or grading or student body or whatever, that you just can't find a good set of cut scores. But ultimately, it really comes down to whether or not you can find good cut scores, and it's pretty hard to tests aren't, just like we talk about tests not really being valid in a vacuum. They're valid for a specific purpose. The cut scores are your way of showing that this test is valid for our particular purpose. We're using it to place into courses at our campus. If we can find cut scores that help us do that successfully, then it's a good test for us, and otherwise it's not.
Yep.
Well, very good. That is the last of the questions that I have. Jim, if you wouldn't mind turning that slide to our schedule there. As you can see, the next and actually the last webinar we have coming up is October 26th regarding fairness. Invitations will be on the way. And that brings us to the end of this particular webinar. If you would like to ask Jim and Sonia any individual questions, there are their email addresses on the screen for you. If you would like to see and learn more about Tailwind, please join us at www.tailwindtesting.com and check us out and look us over and take a look at our demo test and so on. Once again, on behalf of the team here at Tailwind, on behalf of Jim Wallach and Sonia Sevdevi, I would like to thank you for spending part of your day with us here today and attending our webinar series. Hope it was meaningful for you, and we hope to see you again at the next one. Take care, everybody, and have a good day.